Mind Your Farm Business on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by RBC Royal Bank.
Welcome to another episode of the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. I'm your host, Shaun Haney of RealAgriculture.com and Real Ag Radio on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Today, we're tackling a topic that every farmer and rancher will encounter at some point: the handshake versus the contract. While handshakes are rooted in trust and tradition, the complexities of modern agriculture raise the question: when does a verbal agreement hold up, and when should we formalize things more in writing? To help us navigate this, we're joined by David Kozicki. He's a lawyer with MLT Aikins out of Edmonton. David brings both experience and practical insights to the table, sharing when a handshake works, when it doesn't, and how you can protect yourself without feeling like you're betraying trust. From the risks of informality to real-life examples like how a thumbs-up emoji became a legally binding contract, this conversation will highlight the balance between relationships, risk management, and smart business practices. Let's get to minding your farm business. David, welcome to the Mind Your Farm Business podcast.
Thanks, Shaun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is a kind of a cool topic. One that is, I think this impacts any farm or ranch across the country. Today, we're talking about the handshake versus the contract, okay? Maybe old school, new school. That's probably a little bit too simplified, but wanted to chat with somebody like yourself who has that legal background as a lawyer that can shed some light on the do's and do nots when it comes to this topic. So let's start off the top. Explain the historical, like the significance of the handshake in our industry of agriculture and why it's so common from your experience.
Yeah, I think, and they don't teach us handshake 101 in law school, but, I think where it started back in the, ancient Roman times even, it was a symbol of honesty and trust. And there was even a practicality to it where you would show your hands and go to shake, showing you're unarmed and therefore you could trust me. And so it really has a deep-seated root in those two concepts of trust and honesty. And then over time, as the law progressed and the idea of contracts progressed, we started developing more formalities to relationships. And you started coming up with concepts of written contracts and even, the Old English seal in wax type concepts. So much more formal. And I think where agricultural communities really grabbed hold of it was due to being rural and not having easy access to those more formal methods of formalizing contracts. The handshake became the seal of the deal. And that's a concept that has just stuck over time because agricultural communities are very deep in cooperation and community, and a lot of that goes hand in hand with the concepts of trust and honesty. And you've still got communities that are relatively small and close-knit and may not have easy access to those more formal mechanisms to formalize contracts, which is changing with today's technology, of course, but and I think that's really where that deep ingrain into the agricultural context comes from.
I always think of it, this topic, remember in Jerry Maguire? Hey, he was recruiting Kush and he's talking to the dad and he thinks he's got him signed, right? And the dad says, I don't do contracts. I just give you my word and it's stronger than oak. Shook hands and then we know where that all went. Downhill. That's the downside of this, right?
That's the downside. I mean, anytime you enter, into contractual relationships, there's got to be a level of trust and you're trying to protect from the uncertainty. I always kind of say if everybody did what they thought the other party was going to do and everybody did what you thought they were going to do, the world would have a lot less lawyers. But unfortunately, either due to changing circumstances or just not knowing the full extent of what you're trying to accomplish, often those minor issues come around, and that's where contracts fall apart.
So from a legal standpoint, what distinguishes a handshake agreement from a formal written contract?
Well, like a contract has four basic pillars, and that doesn't matter if it's an oral contract or a written contract. You need an offer, you need an acceptance. So you've got those two main factors in a contract. Then you also have certainty of terms, so the parties have agreed on the basic terms of the contract. And you need consideration. You need something going both ways. And so whether you've got those four pillars in a written contract or a verbal handshake agreement, they still need to all appear. And there's three others. You need to make sure that you have the intention of creating legal relationships. We can't just jokingly say, hey, Shaun, I'll buy your car for $100. You say, hey, great, Dave. And I go, oh, we got a contract. There was clearly no intention to create that relationship. The capacity of the parties, you can't enter into contracts with people that don't have mental capacity or minors. And obviously you can't create a contract for an illegal purpose. So those are naturally void. But so you take those three items out. If the contract has those four pillars, then you've got a valid contract, whether it's written or not.
So, and this doesn't have to be like an all or none scenario. I am sure there are still, in today's world, agreements where they can be a handshake. But let's talk about that a little bit. When is a handshake deal appropriate? And or when should we, is there like a trigger or a line where we're like, you know what, just for the both of our sake, maybe we should have a formal contract?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it really comes down to you've got to analyze the situation that you're trying to create and decide how much risk is involved in the transaction, what's at stake, and how much of that risk you're willing to expose yourself to. It's first of all, you gotta peel off a number of contracts that have to be in writing. Okay, so things with government, anything to do with government subsidies, that type of stuff, typically all has to be in writing. Anything dealing with land, the sale of land must be in writing. Anything to do with third parties. So if you're bringing in banking or financing or investors into a transaction, 99% of the time, there's going to have to be a formal contract involved. So if you strip all that stuff aside, I think the first important concept to look at is obviously the relationship of the parties. There's obviously a big difference between, two families or two farmers that have lived and worked together for perhaps multi-generational, and every year they do the same deal. I buy something from you, you sell it to me, I pay you, and we do it on a handshake. Yeah. Versus, entering into an agreement with a new entity or new person to the community or a large national corporation that you've never done business with before. There's that trust factor that's got to be earned before you feel more comfortable doing it on a handshake type deal. I think the second is probably the complexity of the transaction. So when you start dealing with extremely large sums of money or large quantities of unknown product, such as in grain type transactions, there's a big difference between buying and selling equipment or a known product versus, a multi-year land lease to buying and selling an agribusiness. There's just a number of different factors that come into play. So you really have to analyze, look, do I fully understand the complexity of what I'm trying to accomplish with the other person or the other party? And have we hammered out all the fine details that could come back later and cause us issues?
Materiality, like you mentioned that, if we're talking like a small amount of money, lower risk, if I lost, if the deal goes entirely sideways, I'm not exactly out, I'm not losing my business. That's different than something where, man, if this goes sideways, I am like in a lot of trouble. Those are two, and of course there's a big gray area in the middle of that. Curious, should you be offended, even if you've been maybe it's a new company or a new entity you're doing a deal with, or maybe it's a neighbor you've been doing business with a long time. That's probably more the case. Should you be offended if they say, you know what, for both of us, I actually would like this in writing?
I don't think so. I think, especially in today's day and age where it becomes very easy to do some sort of formal written not even formal, informal, but written communication, an email, a text, something along those lines, just to set the parameters under which the deal is done, to ensure that both parties are fully aware of the terms. It protects both parties. It adds as a reminder down the road, especially if you're looking at a longer term type transaction. It just sets the facts that, hey, this is what we agreed to. See, remember, this is what we texted. You communicated back and said, hey, yeah, I agree. So we've got a basis of a record of the agreement that we came to. And that's kind of the additional factor you've got to look at is the timeline of the transaction, right? You can go down the road, if you're looking to lease a piece of land for a short term versus an extended period where your business depends on having access to that land for a long period of time, there's a big difference there. Transition of estates, that becomes a big issue, right? If, often we'll see situations where mom and dad are getting up in years, multiple kids, some of which stay on the farm and some don't, and there is a verbal promise of, hey, if you stay and work the land, the whole farm will be yours one day.
I have first right of refusal.
First right of refusal. I have an option. Dad said the land is mine.
Yeah.
We had a case once where the elderly parents, their goal was to make sure the land would never be developed. It was starting to get closer and closer to an urban center.
Yeah.
But they didn't do anything formal about it, and you're just leaving it on the trust of that your next of kin or your kids or your beneficiaries are going to actually follow those wishes. So, anything really long term, you got to watch out for. And then the second is volatility, which, of course, the agricultural business is full of it with weather and crop failures and market volatility. High volatile transactions probably should be a little more formalized than just a handshake.
I think too, I was just thinking about this from just making up an example, volume of the number of transactions that you're doing. So for example, I'm a feed yard and I'm buying feeder cattle. If I'm buying feeder cattle in one transaction from one rancher, I can probably keep it straight in my head. Now, if I've got 100 of those and all of those are at different prices and different delivery dates, that volume works against me trying to keep it all straight in my brain. Even if I think I'm the sharpest person out there, we can get kind of mixed up. Was that person or was it that person? Oh man, now that you ask, then nothing worse in a deal than going back to the person and saying, do you remember what we agreed to? And listen, we've all been there. That's just human nature and that happens. So I think the volume or number of transactions would definitely be a factor here too.
Well, absolutely. And there's also the practicality when you're dealing with large volumes that your back office or your accounting department in particular is not going to get happy when all of a sudden hundreds or thousands of transactions start rolling through and there's not a lick of paper on any of them.
Yeah. And characteristics too. When the price is determined by characteristics, like there's sliding scale based on weight, or there's sliding scale based on quality, which can happen in grain, for example, things like that. Those characteristics, the more of those kind of deals, that also would be a factor for sure.
Yeah.
So, David, where I like to go next is, we've talked about some made up examples, but I know you worked on you brought into this discussion an actual example of something happening, and this could happen to really any of us, and it showcases the downside in this issue between handshake and what's a deal versus an actual contract. So let's look at the example. It's actually from recent history.
Yeah, it's an incident that took place in 2021, and it's not specifically a handshake deal, but it does represent the risks of informality in contracts. So I recently went to court in 2023 in a very simple fact pattern, to be honest. It's called the Southwest Terminal case. Basically, Southwest Terminal was a grain buyer, and they were buying grain from a rather large producer. Southwest Terminal's agent sent out a text blast, as I'm sure many people do these days, to all their producers saying, hey, we're looking for November flaxseed at $17 a bushel. And this was in March of 2021. the producer got back in touch with him. The father that ran the company got back in touch with the agent for the buyer. They had a good discussion. We're interested. Looks good so far. The buyer then calls the farmer's son, who is the decision maker of the corporate farming company, and had a discussion with him. And yep, this looks good. Get a contract done up. Let's get her done. The buyer's agent then goes back, prepares the formal contract. Somewhat important to note, it's a 2-page contract. The front is all the specific terms, and the back is your standard terms and conditions that would apply to any deal. The buyer's agent then takes a picture of that front page, texts it over to the son, who then quickly responds with a thumbs up emoji. Fast forward the clock, November rolls around, there's a crop failure, and flax is now $41 a bushel, so up 240%. The producer doesn't provide on the contract, doesn't deliver. So now they go to court. Because, of course, the buyer's sitting there thinking we've got a valid contract, and the producer's saying, no, we didn't have a contract.
We'll get back to the Mind Your Farm Business podcast shortly, but first a word from our sponsor, RBC Royal Bank.
This episode of Mind Your Farm Business podcast is brought to you by RBC. As an agricultural producer, you're putting a lot of thought into your operation every day. You probably have more than a couple of ideas on how to handle challenges, like market fluctuations, unexpected weather, or simply weighing the pros and cons of adopting new technology. But knowing where to start? That's where a solid risk management strategy can help. Visit rbc.com/risk management to learn more.
So that thumbs up could mean, hey, let's do the deal, or it could be thumbs up, hey, I received what you sent me.
Well, and that's a lot where the case turned. So a lot of the discussion in the case was about, okay, what does a thumbs up emoji mean? Even looking at definitions and past usages and what does it come down to?
Young people actually tell me we're not even supposed to use thumbs up emojis, but that's a whole other discussion. Sorry, continue.
And then the other major factor that came into play here was the buyer's agent and this farming company, specifically the son, had a long-standing relationship. So 9 or 10 years old, and in fact, there was 3 or 4 recent incidences reported between the two where a contract was basically signed almost the exact same way. Text over a picture of the contract, but in all of those, it was responded with words. Looks good, okay, yep. And in all of those, the farmer delivered on the contract. So looking at that in totality, you'd be thinking, hey, slam dunk, this must be an agreement. On the farmer side of the coin, they look at the situation and they responded with, well, no, there wasn't a whole lot of time between receiving that contract and me giving the thumbs up where you couldn't have reasonably believed I had a chance to look at it. You only sent me the front page. You didn't send me the standard terms and conditions. And all 3 of those prior contractual relationships you referred to was all for grain on hand. It was not pre-harvest or pre-production grain. And anytime that I do those type of contracts, I want an act of God or a force majeure provision which protects me in the event of a crop failure. So that was the defense on the other side. Basically, that there was an uncertainty of terms, which goes back to those 4 pillars, and therefore no contract.
Is that ultimately what was decided? No contract?
No. Ultimately, the court looked at it, and they ultimately decided there was a contract.
Oh, wow.
That due to the totality of all the events, including that long history and the prior examples of how they've done business before, that it was a binding contract. And what's somewhat interesting about the case is most provinces now can have a electronic documents or electronic execution act, which deals with documents that are transmitted electronically and signed electronically. And the judge even went so far as to say, in this case, in this fact pattern, that thumbs up emoji is tantamount to a signature. It's a digital signature in that specific fact scenario. One of the other, if you remember, we went back or earlier, we talked about certain situations where a contract or at least a written document is required, and a lot of the provinces carry sale of goods acts, which require something in writing signed to satisfy that requirement. this agreement fell under that act as well, and the court found that, well, it was in writing, and that thumbs up was a signature to the agreement.
Wow. Okay, some of our audience would have heard of that case, so that there's a bit of a sobering wake up. We'll call it. Be careful. Or I guess think about some of the things you're responding, especially electronically, or what you're saying. I guess on that note of enforceability, that's a really good case study for us all to consider. What is the enforceability of, like, say you and I, like, I'm going to buy X amount of straw bales and we agree on a price and we shake on it and then we have a disagreement. Is it actually enforceable if we've just shook hands?
It is, because again, if it meets those four pillars, we've agreed on the terms. We had an offer and acceptance. The shaking of hands can indicate that we've agreed. You can have that binding contract. So I think where people need to be careful, and as sad as it is, I often advise clients, imagine you're in court and you're on the stand and you're trying to prove, hey, this was the deal. Because ultimately that's what you're trying to protect from, is if things go sideways, how am I going to prove my side of the disagreement?
Now, you mentioned like a land deal. So that makes sense. I'm going to get it papered by a lawyer, no matter, and there's different rates of pay. We can talk about lawyer rates later, Dave, but there's legal costs to that. But that makes sense to me. It's a land deal. They need to paper it. All good. But on some things, is there not like a happy middle ground where we can still have a handshake? Maybe we don't need to get a lawyer involved, but we need to have something written down. Is that okay to do something like that?
Well, I think self-preservation wise, you should always get your lawyer involved.
Yeah.
No, you know what? All joking aside, I do think that anybody who does, numerous business transactions should have a lawyer and an accountant in their circle of trust. Somebody that you can call and just bounce the ideas off, and your lawyer should be able to say, hey, you know what? Here's the risks, roll the dice, and away you go. But if you are going to proceed without formalizing a contract, at least try to gather some backup information to help protect you if things do go sideways. And whether that's a text, an email, it's often a good practice to get into the habit of, after a conversation, follow up with an email and say, hey, further to our conversation, we agreed I would deliver A, B, C, and you're going to pay me this for that, and we'll get it done by X date. Is that correct? Right? And hopefully you get the response back, and now you've got at least a paper trail that says, hey, this is what we agreed to, and that starts the foundation of proving something. Witnesses are a good example. Now you don't have to drag along a specific notary or a commissioner, but, if other people are present, make some notes on, hey, I talked with Shaun on X date. This person and this person were both present. Even keeping a diary of your business dealings, right? Of X date, we talked about this, on Y date, we talked about this, and on this date, I sent them an email. Again, with that mindset of, if things go sideways, I might need this information to prove my side of the argument.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like the balance of this. We're not saying that every single agreement that you may have, large or the tiniest of deals, needs to be papered by a lawyer. You kind of do need to look at each one individually and on its own merits, right? That's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, you do. And again, I think fundamentally it comes down to how much risk is involved in the deal and how much risk are you willing to accept, or what's the worst case outcome if the other party doesn't do what you think they're going to do.
Here's what I look at is like, okay, like sometimes my first cost is my best cost, right? Like in terms of like my dad, I tell stories about him all the time, but it's like, honestly, because, judging this deal on its merit, probably should get a lawyer to craft it. And that's probably cheaper than if something goes wrong on the deal and we've got to sue somebody because they didn't follow through on what we thought. Litigation, way more expensive than having a lawyer look at a contract.
Exactly. And that's often, in today's day and age of litigation, that's often where you end up with that conundrum of, do I just eat the loss or do I sue? Because often the costs of litigation are going to far outweigh what you're going to recover, and it just doesn't make sense. So, it's definitely the biggest factor you got to think about. And I don't think you need to think of it as contract versus handshake. I think they can go hand in hand. We can agree on something, handshake deal on it, and follow it up with some sort of paper.
I mentioned earlier, I asked the question about, the reaction that you would have if somebody came to you and said, hey, you know what, I would like to paper this. We've been doing this over a handshake for a long time, but I would like to maybe take this to the next level for a number of reasons. And some people get offended by that kind of stuff. What about the reverse? If I am been in some sort of a deal and I've been renting land from a family and I can see sort of like the writing on the wall here, people are getting up in age and it's a huge risk to me if I lose this land. And I think maybe we need to get something actually in a contract. Are there best ways to approach that scenario? Like is it say, hey, to protect both of us, or are you just outright like, hey, parents are getting old and I want to make sure that the two off farm siblings don't screw this up for me? Like, how do you go about that conversion from handshake to something that's a little bit more formal?
Yeah, I think it's all in that approach. I mean, it's about bringing it in exactly on that basis of, hey, this is for the benefit of both of us. The parents are getting older. Sooner or later, somebody's going to pass away. Even in a corporate context, you might be dealing with somebody who's been there for years. That doesn't mean they're going to be there next year. And the agent or the sales rep that you have trust in that longstanding relationship is no longer there. So they may not remember that you've got a handshake deal in the background. So I think it's all in the approach. And then I think the second comment there would be it's all in the paper that you deliver. So you might have that initial conversation with somebody and they're open to that concept of, yeah, you're right, let's formalize it. And then you throw a 57-page, highly legalese document at them and they go, whoa, the back gets up right away. Yeah. Right? Because they think that now you are trying to take advantage of the situation by either changing the terms or putting things in that are going to take advantage. So it's a balance between the approach of how to get them to the table, sort of, to discuss the contract, and then it's also what type of paper you're throwing in front of them. Because often on the other side, they don't want to have to run off and get a lawyer now to review it for their side. So now you've got two lawyers in on the transaction. So if you can get the paper to them in an easily readable format that still sets everything out and is fully binding, but at least makes it easy, you'll often, especially with a less sophisticated party, there's going to be more comfort on that side.
David, this has been awesome. Thanks so much for joining us here today on the Mind Your Farm Business podcast. Really do appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Shaun. It's been a fantastic experience.
That's a wrap on another episode of the Mind Your Farm Business podcast. A big thank you to David Kozicki of MLT Aikins at Edmonton for joining us today and sharing his insights on the handshake versus the formal contract. David's advice was clear. Trust and relationships are important, but having something in writing, whether it's a text, an email, or a full contract, can save both parties from misunderstandings down the road and maybe costing you a lot of money. Whether it's a simple deal or a complex high-stakes agreement, taking the time to assess risk and document terms can prevent major headaches. And as we learned, even a thumbs up emoji can carry more legal weight than you might have expected at first. For more information on the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, head over to mindyourfarmbusiness.com. And a big thank you again to our sponsor, RBC Royal Bank. If you have any questions or feedback, don't hesitate to reach out to me at shaney@realagriculture.com, or you can call the Real Ag Feedback line, 855-776-6147. Until next time, keep on minding your farm business.